already.
Maybe you want to do the match, I don't know.
Yeah. I got it this time. Just because last time I was on fire doesn't mean that I have to be faithful. No, one time. So then
We're going to start
we're starting on page 128.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
We're going to start on page 128.
With Maya Hayom, please join with us. Maya Hayom, Shabbat Shalom. Maya Hayom, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.
Continue on page 120, and I'd like to invite Rachel and Rose to come forward to kindle the Shabbat candles.
Better luck.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, there you go.
Amen. Asher Koah, thank you. Continue with Lachad Odin on page 138.
Lechad Odin likrat kala, b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Lechad Odin likrat kala, b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Lechad Odin, Lechad Odin likrat kala. Shabbat nekabela, lechad Odin likrat kala. Pnei Shabbat nekabela, shamor v'zachor v'dibur echad. Ishri anu el hamiuchad, Adonai echad u'shemo echad. L'shemo tiferet v'litila. Lechad Lechad Odin likrat kala, Pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lechad Odin likrat kala, Pnei Shabbat nekabela. Likrat Shabbat lechu v'melcha, ki hi mekor haberacha. Merosh mikadem nisucha, Sot ma'aseh b'machshavat tefila. Lechad Odin likrat kala, Pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lechad Odin likrat kala, Pnei Shabbat nekabela. Hitoreri, ki ba'oreh kumi ori, uri, shir daberi, kevod Adonai alayich nigla. Lechad Odin likrat kala, Pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lechad Odin likrat kala, Pnei Shabbat nekabela.
Please rise and face the doors. We greet our Sabbath Queen.
Bo'ii v'shalom ateret bala, gam b'simcha u'b'tzola, tov emunei am segula, bo'ii chala, bo'ii chala. Lechad
Shabbat Mekabela. May be seated as we continue with Shalom Aleichem, page 142.
Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Hasharet, Malachei Elyon, Mimelech, Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem v'shalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Elyon, Mimelech, Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Baruchuni l'shalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Elyon, Mimelech, Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tzidkem l'shalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Elyon, Mimelech, Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Please rise for the Chatz Kaddish, page 144. Yitzchak v'yitzchak Hashem Rabbah.
Amen.
V'yamadi v'rach Yerutei v'yamlich malchutei.
B'chayechon v'yom echon u'chayev'cho Beit Yisrael ba'gala ba'gala u'bizman karim
V'yimeru
Amen.
Yehi Shmei Rabbah mevorach
Le'olam le'omei omaya Yitbarach
Yitbarach v'yishtabach Yitbar v'yitrama v'yitnaseh V'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yit'halal Shemei d'Kudusha
Berichu
Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata
Tushbecha v'necha Tamiram v'loma
Mimeru
Amen.
Barechu et Adonai HaMevorach Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam Vaed.
May be seated. We continue at the top of page 149 together. Praise to you, Adonai, our God, from whom the evening flows. Your wisdom sets the way on which time and season glide. Your breath guides the sail of the stars. Creator of the tide of time and light, you guide the current of day into night. As heaven spans to infinity, you set its course for eternity. Praise to you, Adonai, our God, from whom the evening flows. Baruch atah Adonai, Hama'ariv Aravim.
Ahavat Olam, Beit Yisrael, Amcha Ahavta, Amcha Ahavta, Torah u'mitzvot, Chukim u'mishpatim, Otanu
בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבבך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם למות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי, הייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם אלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
We join together at the top of page 157. Standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt, that there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there, except by joining hands, marching together.
מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות אוסף אלה, נורא תהילות אוסף אלה, מלכותך רבו בניך בוקר היום, לפני משה ומרים, זה אלי אנו ויאמרו, אדוני ימלוך, אדוני ימלוך, לעולם ועד.
ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגאלום יד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני ישראל.
Amen. We join together at the top of page 161. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Adonai, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we may lie down in peace and rise up waiting to do your will.
Baruch atah Adonai haporei sukat shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol amo Yisrael, ve'al Yerushalayim, ve'al kol amo, ve'al Yerushalayim, shalom, ve'al Yerushalayim, ve'al kol amo, ve'al Yerushalayim, shalom. Baruch atah Adonai haporei sukat shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol amo Yisrael. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, לעשות את השבת לדורתם בריתם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורתם בריתם. ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asot et HaShabbat V'doratam L'Ridolam
Ubayom HaShavi Shavot Vayinafash Shavot Vayinafash Shavat Vayinafash
B'Shamru B'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asot et HaShabbat V'doratam L'Ridolam.
Please rise for the tefillah as we continue on page 164.
Adonai Sifataytita Ufiyai Giteirotecha Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Elohei Avotenu V'Imotenu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel Elohei Leah Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHanora El Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim V'konei HaKol V'zocher Chasdei Avot V'imahot U'megidulah Livnei B'neihem L'man Shemo V'Yahava Melech Hoser Moshiach U'Magen Baruch Atah Adonai Magen Avraham Yezrat Sarah Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai Mechayei HaKol Atah Rav Le'Hoshia Mashiv HaRuach U'Marin HaGashem Mechalkel Chaim B'Chesed Mechayei HaKol B'Rachamim Rabim Somech Noflim V'Rofei Cholim U'Matir Asurim U'Mekayem Emunato L'Shenei Afar Milchamocha B'Gevurot U'Mito Melach Melech Meimid U'Mechayeh U'Matzmiach Yeshua Leman Atah Hayot HaKol Baruch Atah Adonai Mechayei HaKol Atah Kadosh V'Shimcha Kadosh U'Kedoshim B'Cho Yom Yadenu K'Selah Baruch Atah Adonai Ha'el HaKadosh.
Be seated. We continue together at the top of page 173. May these hours of rest and renewal open our hearts to joy and our minds to truth. May all who struggle find rest on this day. May all who suffer find solace. May all who hurt find healing on this day. May all who despair find purpose. May all who hunger find fulfillment on this day. And may this day fulfill its promise. Baruch Atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat. We continue at the top of page 175 together. Ever-present one, may we, your people Israel, be worthy in our deeds and our prayer. Wherever we live, wherever we seek you, in this land, in Zion restored, in all lands you are our God, whom alone we serve in reverence. Baruch Atah Adonai, Sha'otecha Levadecha Ve'yira Na'avod. On page 177, we join together at the top of the page. God of goodness, we give thanks for the gift of life, wonder beyond words, for the awareness of soul, our light within, for the world around us so filled with beauty, for the richness of the earth which day by day sustains us. For all these and more, we offer thanks. Baruch Atah Adonai, Hatov Shimcha V'Lecha Na'eh Lehodot.
We are going to continue on page 179 with the Hebrew in the middle. Lo yisakoy el goy cherem, lo yilmedu od milchama.
Lo yisakoy el goy cherem, lo
yomedu od milchama. Lo yisagoy el goy heref, velo yomedu od milchama. Lo yisagoy el goy heref, velo yomedu od milchama. Lo yisagoy el goy heref, lo yomedu od milchama. Lo yisagoy el goy heref, lo yomedu od milchama. Those words come from the prophet Isaiah, translated to, nation shall not take up sword against nation, they shall never again know war. The following words come from the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, who added to that, don't stop after beating the swords into plowshares. Don't stop. Go on beating and make musical instruments out of them. Whoever wants to make war again will have to turn them into plowshares first. We continue on page 371 with the Mishabera. Family, anyone that we know in need of healing at this time? Is there anyone in the front rows think of anyone?
Or no?
Sure. Continue together. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. Turn back to page 180. We will resume after we've had an opportunity for silent prayer. Passover is in 2 weeks. Usually the week before Passover I deliver a sermon about Passover, but next week it's a family service. I'm probably not going to give one of my traditional Passover services. Sermons rather, I should say. So either my Passover sermon is about how to observe Passover, or sometimes it's about how we know that the Last Supper was not a Passover Seder. And tonight, just this once, I thought, why not the best of both worlds? So highlights from both sermons. First of all, question is, how long is Passover? My family always observed 7 days, but you can imagine my surprise the time I showed up at my college girlfriend's house the day after Passover with pizza and beer, only to discover that her family observed 8 days. So what does the Torah say about Passover? It says, you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, eating unleavened bread for 7 days, as I have commanded you. That's Exodus chapter 34:18. But some traditional families observe 8 days, adding a day, as the Orthodox do, in case our calendar is inaccurate, despite the fact that our calendar has been accurate since the days of the Talmud. The Reform movement and most of Israel, whether they're Orthodox or not, including the Orthodox in Israel, observe 7 days rather than 8 days. But those who enjoy an extra day of the bread of affliction, all the power to you. Now, what about kitniot? The Hebrew word for foods such as rice and legumes, which are often avoided on Passover. The Torah doesn't say anything about that. Some Ashkenazic Jews do not eat kitniot on Passover, but it may be helpful to consider the following. First of all, the Torah doesn't say anything about not eating rice or legumes on Passover, so there's nothing in the Torah that forbids it. Secondly, the chametz that's traditionally prohibited includes wheat, barley, oats, rye, and spelt, and those are delineated in the Talmud. They knew about rice and peas and soybeans, but they didn't mention those in the list. So if they wanted to prohibit them during the days of the Talmud, they would have excluded things like rice and beans and peas, but they chose not to at that time. With regard to rice, believe it or not, the Talmud actually permits matzah to be made out of rice. I've never had rice matzah before, but you can make a matzah out of rice flour, and there's a recipe for it in the Talmud, provided that it's not leavened in any way. You can use rice as opposed to wheat to make your matzah if you wanted to. The first mention, believe it or not, of any prohibition of having rice or legumes on Passover was not until the 13th century, so that's relatively modern compared to a lot of our other traditions. And that first mention that we have is by 2 French authorities. France did not have the largest Jewish population in the world at that time, but there were 2 French authorities, and they mentioned that there is a custom that some people don't eat rice or legumes on Passover, but they say even in France it's not universally accepted, and they say that many of the most respected sages of their generation do not follow that tradition. So it's not a question of how stringent you are, it was just they mentioned there's a few people who do that, but they're in the minority. The 13th century argument by those who did avoid eating kitniot, rice and legumes, they said that rice and legumes are not chametz, but they urged people to avoid it anyhow, claiming that legumes somehow resemble chametz and should be prohibited lest we mistake, say, a donut for a pea. But it's not a very compelling argument, and that's why people, even at the time, it wasn't very popular. The other French sage who mentions this custom suggests that the prohibition ought to be dismantled altogether and that people should be forbidden to avoid rice and legumes on Passover. The custom never spread to Sephardic Jews from Spain, who ended up throughout North Africa and Turkey and around the world, and people such as Moses Maimonides, Joseph Caro, Isaac Luria, famous Sephardic rabbis, they all ate rice and legumes on Passover. So if it's good enough for those guys, it could be good enough for us as well. As recently as the 18th century, Ashkenazic legal scholars such as Rabbi Yaakov Emden argued against the prohibition, and they said that it should be permitted to have those things. In Israel, almost everyone has no issues with rice and legumes on Passover, whether you're Orthodox, whether you're Ashkenazic, Sephardic, it doesn't matter. The reality is, in our own families, even though it may not have been the way that we observed Passover when we were kids, odds are you go back 3, 4, 5 generations, they had no issue eating rice or legumes on Passover. All that being said, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. In my house, my family eats kitniot on Passover. We don't have any issue with that. But when we're visiting my mother's house, my parents' house, we don't push it. We do whatever they want to do in their houses. You do not want to get into an argument with my mother, believe me. While we're on the subject of observing Passover, I want to take this opportunity to mention a suggestion that I'm making in the April Bulletin, which should be out hopefully this Monday. And I'm asking families to post at least one picture or video from their family Seder on Temple Shalom's Facebook page. You know, Passover is one of those holidays that's mostly observed in the home rather than in the synagogue. And because it's observed in the home, even though we're following many of the same traditions, we hide the afikomen, we eat harosa, the recipes are completely different, the way we set the tables are completely different, and it's a very unique, personalized kind of thing. And so it could be fun if everyone were to post some sort of a picture, and it's a way for us to see how Passover is observed in different people's houses. So we'll experiment with that new tradition this year and see if people are inclined to post pictures. I think it would be fun, and you know, it's very different in different places. It could be a little video of someone doing the 4 questions, or it could be, you know, just a picture of the table before you have the meal, or a table full of family, whatever you like. I just think that would be fun to do. Now, last but not least, how do I know that the Last Supper was not a Passover Seder? Well, first of all, in the Christian Bible, the Gospel of John states quite clearly in chapter 19 that Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation before Passover. If the Last Supper was the day before Jesus was crucified, and Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation, then the Last Supper had to be the day before the day of preparation, which is 2 days before the Passover Seder. So it would not have been a Passover Seder. Secondly, the Gospel of Mark records that Jesus took bread at the meal. Mark was originally written in Greek, a language which has 2 separate words for leavened bread and unleavened bread. They had both words in their vocabulary. So if, in fact, the Last Supper had been a Passover Seder, then Mark chapter 14, verse 22 would have recorded that Jesus ate unleavened bread if it was a Passover Seder. That's part of our tradition, but it actually uses a different Greek word. I'm probably not going to pronounce this correctly, azimois or something like that, that is actually not the right word. So since Mark uses the word for leavened bread, then it could not have been a Passover Seder, because who eats leavened bread at a Passover Seder? Third, Rabban Gamliel, who sort of constructed the Passover Seder as we observe it today, he was explicit. The person has not fulfilled the mitzvah of the Passover Seder unless that person has discussed the importance of 3 things: the Passover sacrifice, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs. Mishnah Sahim 10:5, Gamliel goes on to explain that the story must be told in terms of God passing over the houses of our ancestors in Egypt for the purpose of permitting them to offer sacrifices to the one and only God. The unleavened bread must remind us of the haste in which our ancestors left Egypt, and the bitter herbs have to recall the bitterness of the Hebrews that they endured as slaves in Egypt. Unlike Rabban Gamliel, Mark describes the Last Supper with no mention of the bitter herbs, no interpretation of the sacrifice. Furthermore, the symbolism that Mark ascribes to the leavened bread is completely different from the Jewish understanding of unleavened bread. It's reminiscent of rushing out of Egypt before the bread had time to rise. Moreover, Mark describes the leavened bread eaten by the disciples as symbolic of consuming the body of Jesus. Any meal in which leavened bread is consumed as though it were the body of Jesus could not be a Passover Seder by definition. Given the fact that the key elements of Passover Seder are missing in the book of Mark, the bread is leavened, and the book of John clearly states that the Last Supper took place before Passover. The Last Supper could not possibly have been a Passover Seder. Surely Jesus must have had a Last Supper, for sure, and he would have had some sort of a meal at that Last Supper, but it probably wasn't a Seder, and it doesn't say that it was even in the Christian scriptures. We've just sort of come to believe the paintings that we see, but those paintings were not eyewitness accounts, and it probably was not a Seder, although it was, generally speaking, that time of year. So why is it so important to dispel the myth that the Last Supper was a Seder? When the Last Supper is incorrectly depicted as a Seder, it gives a false impression that Christianity somehow fulfills or even perfects Judaism. Christianity is as fine a religion as any other, including Judaism, but each religion brings something unique and different to the table. We have a great deal in common, but one doesn't fulfill the other, and one isn't better than the other. We do both religions a disservice when we try to equate the two and say that they're the same thing. They're different. They have different things to offer. They're both beautiful in their own way. So this Passover, enjoy our unique tradition in your own unique way, and perhaps share a photo or two with our congregation on Facebook. Shabbat Shalom, and in 2 weeks, may you have a happy Passover. We invite the kids back.
Thank you. It should be noted, when Rabbi was talking about Kitniot, it got me thinking to my time in Israel, where I met my husband. And we used to go to this chain called Sushi Rehavia, as much as you can get to as a chain in Jerusalem. It had 3 restaurants. For Jerusalem, that's big. And
Sushi in Jerusalem is big.
Seriously,
That's
did
a big
Sushi
deal.
Rehavia even exist when you
No,
were
it did not.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there were 3 restaurants. 2 of them would shut down during Passover because they observed more of an Ashkenazic observance of Pesach, but there was one that was more in like the English-speaking German colony area that stayed open, and that's where we went for dinner every night, and since then we decided to keep a kitniot at home during Pesach.
Oh, all right. Okay. There we go. We're going to continue in our service, page 586, with the Aleinu. I'd ask everyone please to rise.
Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, v'teifilu lo yotzei b'reshit, shelo asanu kigoyei ha'aratzot, ve'lo samanu k'mishpachot ha'adama, shelo sam chalkinu kahem,